What's going on, everybody? Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today I am bringing you 4 bold predictions ahead of Week 6 of the NFL season. Now, keep in mind, these are bold predictions, things that aren't likely to happen, but also not impossible. If they hit, awesome, but if they don't, it was expected that they weren't going to. These are within the realm of possibility, though. But before we dive on into our list, if you are feeling overwhelmed juggling a multitude of fantasy football teams this year, Fantasy Pros will help you simplify things. With My Playbook's multi-league assistant, you can see the latest news, notes, and rankings for every single player across all of your teams. It's all in one spot, making your path to victory clearer and easier. Dive in, let us help you dominate all your leagues this year with the multi-league assistant at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the My Playbook app. Alrighty, y'all, let's dive on in to these bold predictions now ahead of Week 6. Starting with number 1, Terry McLaurin will finish as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver this week. Now, we have yet to see Terry McLaurin finish higher than the wide receiver 14 on any given week this year, but I think this is the week we could potentially get an explosion from him. Over the last 3 weeks, Terry McLaurin has actually been 6th of all wide receivers in receiving yards with 2 100-plus yard games. So we have somewhat of a base to work off of here. It's not like Terry McLaurin has just been cast from existence. He's actually been putting up solid numbers over the last 3 weeks. But then you look at the Week 6 matchup with the Ravens, and that's where this starts to get juicy. The Ravens, they have given up the 5th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this year, the 3rd most receiving yards allowed to wideouts, the 2nd most receiving touchdowns, and this is the kicker, the highest neutral pass rate on defense. Now, what this essentially means is that teams are electing to throw the ball against them when they're not playing from way ahead or way behind on early downs and not in the 2-minute drill, right? Nothing to skew those numbers. When the game is still within reach, teams are electing to throw on the Baltimore Ravens, the highest neutral pass rate on defense. And these stats are because Baltimore's a pass funnel defense, right? Like, they have been stellar against the run this year. They have the 2nd fewest rushing yards allowed to running backs this year. They have been run on at the 2nd lowest rate in the entire league, and they're only allowing 3.1 yards per rush, which is the lowest mark in the entire league. So despite Washington, believe it or not, they've been throwing at the lowest rate in the NFL this year. They'll likely be forced to put the ball into Jaden Daniels' hands on Sunday against a defense that they're not going to be able to run against. So between a secondary that can be exploited, between actually how good Jaden Daniels has looked throwing the ball as of recent, Terry McLaurin, my bold prediction is that he will finish as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver in Week 6. We'll keep it moving here, though. Let's move on to our second bold prediction. We're going to flip the script a little bit, go a bit negative. Bold prediction number 2, Josh Allen finishes outside of the top 15 quarterbacks for what would be the 3rd straight week. Now, you are still starting Josh Allen in all of your leagues because we know his upside is quarterback 1 overall. Okay, this is not a sit Josh Allen take. This is a bold prediction, something that could happen. But this Jets defense is no joke, man. And I think they're going to be playing with a little bit of fire after firing Robert Saleh surprisingly earlier this week. I'm full belief in an interim head coach play with a little bit of fire after your original head coach left earlier in the week. I could sit here and cherry pick the stat line that the Jets are only allowing 7.9 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this year, which is the 2nd lowest mark in the league, but that's ignoring all of the necessary context because the quarterbacks that they played have been Sam Darnold in Week 5, who's been good this year, but they kept him in check, Bo Nix in a monsoon, Jacoby Brissett in Week 3, Will Levis in Week 2, and then Week 1 they played Brock Purdy. So they really haven't played a quarterback at the same level as Josh Allen this year. My biggest worry this week, though, is that the Bills' passing offense struggles against man coverage because nobody in their wide receiver room can separate. That's the biggest downfall when you have this wide receiver room full of gadgety guys and one-trick ponies. These guys just can't separate. The Jets have run man coverage at a top 10 rate in the NFL this year, and Khalil Shakir has really been the only Bills weapon that's been able to get it done against both zone and man coverage. The problem is that as of this recording, he's still listed as day to day. So maybe we get him back in Week 6. But even if we do, is he going to be at 100%. Is that really going to flip the scale enough to get this Bills offense back on track when they face man coverage? So again, you fire up Josh Allen this week because he's freaking Josh Allen, okay? But after his struggles against Houston last week, who was running man coverage, why would the Jets not cook up a similar recipe for success? So I am concerned a little bit that Josh Allen gives us another finish outside of the top 15 quarterbacks for the third straight week. Obviously, his upside is still quarterback one overall, but my bold prediction will be for the third straight week, Josh Allen finishes outside of the top 15 quarterbacks. Third bold prediction now. This is one of my favorite ones of the week. Chris Godwin finishes as a top 3 fantasy wide receiver in week 6. I'm just going to start with this. Happy Mike Evans versus Marshawn Lattimore day to all of you who celebrate out there. This has been a matchup of the decades between these two, and Chris Godwin has obviously been feasting this year already. This is a matchup I love with Marshawn Lattimore on Mike Evans, taking him away in the outside game. New Orleans quietly giving up the 7th most receiving yards to wide receivers this year, and they have the 4th highest neutral pass rate on defense. So again, going back to what we talked about with Baltimore, teams are electing to throw on the Saints when the game is still within reach. You look at Chris Godwin's performances against the Saints in the past as well. Last year, he was the wide receiver 10. He finished in the wide receiver 17. 2022, wide receiver 26. You weren't thrilled with that, and then he actually missed their second game with the Saints. But then you go back to 2021. He did finish as the wide receiver 3 1 week against the Saints that year. So if Marshawn Lattimore is going to limit Mike Evans in this game, I want all of the Chris Godwin possible, especially after we've already seen him finish as the wide receiver 8 and the wide receiver 6 in weeks 1 and 2. Baker also been sneaky on fire this year too. He's already tossed 11 touchdowns this year. Last year he threw for 246 and 309 against the Saints. So I could see this being a game where they put the ball in Baker's hands. They allow him to cook against a secondary that quietly has been giving up quite a bit of yardage to wideouts this year. It doesn't quite show up in the fantasy box score, but it could for Chris Godwin this week, which is why my bold prediction will be that he finishes as a top 3 wide receiver in week 6. Bold prediction number 4. This is like, maybe you think this is stupid obvious, but it's going to need some context. Bijan Robinson scores 30 plus fantasy points, got ahead of myself, against the Carolina Panthers this week. Now, the context that is necessary here. Bijan has yet to have a weekly finish higher than the running back 15. He hasn't scored more than 12.6 fantasy points or 16.2, fantasy points in a game this year. And he only has one game with more than 70 rushing yards. So we are asking Bijan Robinson to essentially double his production from what he's shown us this year against the Carolina Panthers this week. This is the matchup for him to do it though. And it's going to remind us why we all took him in the mid-first round this year. Carolina, they have allowed a running back to score 20 plus fantasy points in every game but one this year. They have been run on at the 2nd highest rate in the league. They have given up the 3rd most rushing yards allowed to running backs. They've given up 10 rushing touchdowns to backs as well. That is the highest mark in the entire NFL. Now, will Tyler Algier still be factored in? Of course he will, but that's also what kind of makes this a bit more bold of a prediction than what it comes across as. So I believe no matter how the Falcons utilize Bijan this week, if it's someone in a committee with Tyler Algier, if it's completely outside zone scheme like they have been, I pray to God they use him in between the tackles this week. Bijan will give you a massive day, no matter how they use him. And this is my pick this week, where he explodes like Derrick Henry did back in week 4. I talked about it with Jordan Mason last week, didn't quite pan out, but I'm going to go to Bijan Robinson against the Panthers this week. I think he scores 30 plus against the Carolina Panthers this week for my final bold prediction. That's it though. Those are 4 bold predictions for you ahead of week 6. Before we sign off here though, remember, if you are juggling a multitude of fantasy football teams and feeling overwhelmed, FantasyPros was going to help you simplify things. With My Playbook's multi-league assistant, you can see the latest news, notes, and rankings for every single player across all of your teams. It's all in one spot, making your path to victory clearer and easier. Dive in. Let us help you dominate all your leagues with the multi-league assistant at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the My Playbook app.